thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and today we're going to talk about some of those albums that the fans just did not like, which happens to just about every band eventually, but for different reasons. Sometimes it's uptight fans that won't accept change or won't let their favorite artists try new things, just like box them in creatively, but then on the other hand, other times, well, the album just plain sucks. So today we are going to look at some of those hated albums from bands like Day to Remember, Green Day, My Chemical Romance, Weezer, and more, and ask the question, was the hate justified? But first, if you haven't, check out my merch, like this Pop Punk with Breakdowns shirt, and a bunch of other designs that's available at the link in the description of this video. First up, we have You're Welcome by A Day to Remember from earlier this year in 2021. And if by some chance you aren't familiar with A Day to Remember, they broke out in the late 2000s, playing a mix of pop punk with metalcore breakdowns that a lot of bands were doing at the time, but nobody did it better than they did. Like, to this day, I would say that their 2009 album Homesick is one of my favorite albums. Like, no skips, 10 out of 10 masterpiece. And so with that in mind, the problem with their newest album, You're Welcome, is that, well, it's just not that. With the exception of a couple heavier songs, it's really more of just like a straight up rock album. Like, a few parts of it literally sound like Imagine Dragons. I'll be honest, as much as I love the band, I really didn't like the album. Although I do like some of the lyrics, especially the song Everything We Need. You can really tell that they've grown into being guys in their 30s with families, which is something I really appreciate. With that said, objectively speaking, I don't think it's a bad album. Like I said, personally, it's not the one I would choose to listen to, but objectively speaking, I do think it's well done. The problem here is that I just don't think it's the right album for A Day to Remember to put out. I probably would have liked it a lot more if there was another band's name on the cover. And so, to answer the question, is the hate justified? I think hate is a bit of a strong word, but I do understand why people didn't like it. And next up, Pinkerton by Weezer. These days, in the sort of rock canon or whatever, Weezer are considered a god-tier, GOAT-level band, but that was not always the case. Their first album came out in 1994, and blew up on the back of the video for their second single, Buddy Holly, and then the third single, Say It Ain't So, which became a certified mainstream hit and got millions and millions of normies into the band practically overnight. But these were not the Weezer fans that you think of today. Again, these were just normies, people who came into it with the expectation that Weezer was kind of like the grunge reincarnation of the Beach Boys, and that their music would be basically like a 90s update to sunny, upbeat 60s pop rock. And so when Weezer's second album, Pinkerton, came out in 1996, fans and the critics were not happy with it, because Pinkerton was not more of that sunny, upbeat Beach Boys stuff that they were expecting. All the reviews pretty much said the same thing, that it was much darker, more raw and noisy, with this kind of like depressed, angsty, brooding sort of tone to the whole thing that reflected Rivers Cuomo's mental state at the time. He seemed to almost like hate being famous, like the bigger they got, the more depressed and angry he became. I did like Weezer's first album quite a bit. Listening to this one, personally, I didn't really think it was that big of a departure from the first album. I mean, yes, it was darker and noisier, but I was also listening to a lot of like death metal and stuff at the time, so I guess to me, the contrast wasn't that big. But regardless, it was pretty much universally seen as a disappointment at the time. The one thing that I do agree with is that there was a lot of criticism about the lyrics, which honestly are kind of cringe. There's a lot of kind of incel energy there, like the song Pink Triangle, which is about how he wishes this lesbian would be in love with him or whatever. But with all of that being said, slowly but surely, the perception of Pinkerton kind of turned on its head. Over the next few years, all the fair weather normie fans who expected more Buddy Holly and Say It Ain't So just sort of went away, moved on to the next thing, like Len or whatever. And at the same time, their core fans who stuck with them started to really appreciate Pinkerton and even elevate it as this masterpiece that was kind of the foundation of what some people would call confessional emo, which predictably Rivers Cuomo also hated. I love this quote about it. "It's just a sick album, sick in a diseased sort of way. It's such a source of anxiety because all the fans we have right now have stuck around because of that album. But honestly, I never want to play those songs again. I never want to hear them again." So is the hate for Pinkerton justified? Well, I would say no. If you ask me, it's not as good as their first album or the Green album that came afterwards, but it's certainly not terrible. On the other hand, I also wouldn't say that it's some sort of like grand epic masterpiece that the super hardcore Weezer nerds seem to think it is.
I'm just a little confused because real Weezer fans know that they haven't had a good album since Pinkerton in '96.
Oh, wow. Uh-oh. Looks like we have a purist in the house.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to have fun with this.
So I would say that Rolling Stone's original score for it was pretty much right on, 3 out of 5. And next up, Danger Days by My Chemical Romance, their fourth and final album from 2010. This is 4 years after putting out what a lot of people would say is the definitive mall emo album, Welcome to the Black Parade, which made a whole generation of kids dye their hair black and get those stripy fingerless gloves. And so just like with Weezer and A Day to Remember and pretty much every other band, fans expected more of that. But Danger Days was definitely not Black Parade Part 2. Whereas the Black Parade was this sort of like dark, brooding, emo rock opera thing, Danger Days is a loud, upbeat, boisterous rock concept album about a group of teenagers fighting against an evil corporation set in this distant post-apocalyptic future. So actually, if you think about it, it was kind of like Final Fantasy VII meets Fallout New Vegas, which by the way would be the best game of all time if someone actually made it. And sonically, it really doesn't even sound like the same band. Like to me, it almost sounds like it should have been part of that garage rock revival from like the mid 2000s that I talked about in my last video. More like the Hives or the Vines or something than My Chemical Romance.
Hit the gas, every crawl,
Which again is just not what the fans wanted. They wanted the Black Parade Part 2, not a bright, upbeat, sci-fi rock opera or whatever. And although the critics gave it pretty good reviews, the fans are really just not into it. Largely because of that like upbeat mood, I think. I mean, happiness is just not what My Chemical Romance fans want. And although I don't think it's a bad album, I actually kind of agree. It kind of sounds like an album that any number of just random generic mid-2000s rock bands could have put out. There's nothing about it that says My Chemical Romance, if that makes sense. And I would say that, you know, honestly, their discography would be better off if this album just wasn't part of it. And next up, an album that I actually forgot existed, Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses. And the reason why I forgot it existed is because my brain said that this album never even came out, but it actually did after being teased for a solid 15 years. I think this album was like officially announced something like 6 times over the course of like 7 years before it finally actually came out. And for the record, I think Guns N' Roses is one of the best fucking bands of all time. I consider their first album, Appetite for Destruction, to be a 10 out of 10 flawless masterpiece without a single moment of weakness on the entire album. It is that good. It's literally one of the best pieces of music ever recorded. If you've never given it a close listen, you really owe it to yourself because it is worth it. Like, put on some headphones, listen to it closely, because this mix, and especially like the guitar arrangements, are absolutely out of this world. Which is unfortunate because Chinese Democracy is just bad. There's just no other way to put it. Somehow Axl Rose spent $13 million making this album, and yet it sounds like some random local band from Cleveland that you would see playing at a bar on a Thursday night to 4 people. And in researching this video, I found that there are actually people who rank this as their favorite Guns N' Roses album. And I don't know who these people are, but if you are one of them, seek help. All right, next up we have Uno Dos Tres by Green Day, which is a trilogy of albums that they put out in 2012 that I think was kind of an attempt at going back to their roots or something.
like a Ferris wheel that keeps breaking down.
Some of the reviews of these albums said that it reminded them of Dookie, which I kind of get, but it actually reminds me of even earlier stuff like Kerplunk. In terms of the songs, the one thing that really throws me off about these albums is the production, which is like weirdly clean and yet bad at the same time. Like it almost sounds unmixed or something. It's very strange. And when it comes to this trilogy, there's really like 3 schools of thought. The first one is that this trilogy totally sucks and it's trash. The second is that it's amazing and every song is wonderful and perfect. And the third school of thought is that some of the songs are okay, but it really should have been cut down to one album. And on that last point, I definitely agree. Between the 3 albums, there are 37 songs. That is way too much material to digest from anybody, even Green Day. But beyond that, my real issue is that I don't think any of these songs are really truly Green Day at their best. Now, none of the songs are terrible because these guys are such fantastic songwriters that even a kind of crappy, half-assed Green Day song is still pretty damn good. But by Green Day standards, they just feel kind of uninspired and formulaic to me. Really not sure why they decided to barf out 37 songs, but I think it was a mistake. So is the hate for this trilogy justified? Well, again, I would say that hate is kind of a strong word, but in general, I would say yes. Their discography honestly would have been better if they just never released these songs at all. These really should have just been demos that never saw the light of day.
Uno, dos, tres.
And on the heavier side of things, we have Illud, Divinum, Insanus, the 2011 album by Morbid Angel, which was a unexpected change of direction for the band. If you're not familiar with this band, they are universally regarded as one of the earliest and best death metal bands of all time. Now, to be clear, I'm obviously biased. I have a big Morbid Angel tattoo on my leg, so clearly I am not impartial. I love this band, but I think most people would agree with me on that. And this album in particular was highly anticipated because it marked the return of their original vocalist David Vincent, who had been out of the band for about 10 years or so while he was off doing the weird gothic industrial band or whatever with his wife called the Genitorturers. And everyone was like, oh fuck yes, David Vincent is back. This is gonna be some of the best death metal of all time. Morbid is back. But instead they got this.
We've been crossing the line since 1989. We're moving the world because our power is a shining sick through. We're fucking magic to prove that the radicals are here to stay.
And to this.
Pounding, pounding, you feel it burning, burning. This lava scorching, we cannot be troubled. This green we're too extreme.
And everyone was like, wait a minute, David Vincent turned Morbid Angel into Genitorturers. What happened? Now, to be fair, most of this album is kind of your standard Morbid Angel stuff. Fast, crazy, super technical death metal. That's as good as all the rest of their stuff. But yeah, the weird like industrial songs are definitely not good. It's almost like death metal Rob Zombie, but somehow even worse than that sounds on paper. But with that said, I actually do respect them for not giving a fuck and trying something crazy and off the wall, regardless of what the fans were gonna think, which in a way is like the most metal thing you could do. And next up, we have Bad Religion. Now, you probably know this band as being one of the founders of melodic hardcore, especially their later albums like Suffer. They're basically the blueprint for NoFX, Lagwagon, Pennywise, and like 90% of the other Southern California skate punk bands in the 90s.
Did you ever see the concrete stairs of every day? The lunatic, the hypocrite are all lost and afraid. Can't see their lives are just like yours.
And these days, Bad Religion is pretty much universally loved, and for good reason. They're a great band with an extremely solid discography. But did you know that in 1983, they put out a really, really bad prog rock album called Into the Unknown? And the story behind the album is actually kind of interesting. Essentially, they self-released their first album in 1981, kind of not really expecting it to go anywhere and having a lot more success than any of them could have imagined. They sold over 10,000 copies of that album in a year or two, in a time where that was just a massive amount for an independent punk band to sell. And they basically figured that that was a fluke. Like, well, there's no way that's gonna happen again. And so they basically said, fuck it. They had no expectations of this being like their career or whatever. And so when it came time to decide what to do next, they were like, you know, we grew up listening to Yes and King Crimson, so let's do a prog rock album. And as much as I love Bad Religion, let's just be real, this album is bad. And that's not just me, even the band thinks so. They've called it a misstep, and they didn't reissue it in any form until like 2010. And I understand why. I would not want my name on this recording either. They were obviously just not good enough musicians to take on this kind of material. The recording was rushed. Sounds like the guitars are out of tune half the time. It's just not good. But with that being said, I think it's cool that they took a chance and just did something purely for creative satisfaction. And if you think about it, this album was kind of a preview of where Epitaph Records would go. This is the label started by Bad Religion's guitarist Brett Gurewitz, which in my opinion is the most successful and consistent independent label of all time, with the kind of defining characteristic being the kind of creative and artistic breadth that they have. I mean, they've put out everything from Pennywise to Atmosphere to Bring Me the Horizon to Lil Lotus. And so in some ways, this album was just kind of a preview of that, I think. And last but not least, in some way, shape, or form, by 4 Year Strong. 4 Year Strong was another one of the big names in the pop punk with breakdown scene of the late 2010s. Reminder to get your pop punk with breakdown shirts at the link in the description of this video. Also known as Easycore, with the other big bands in that subgenre being Day to Remember, Set Your Goals, and The Wonder Years. And they did it really well. I saw them in like 2008, I think. It was one of the most fun shows I've ever been to, and their first album holds up as a pop punk classic, I would say. Which is why I was so surprised when this album came out a few years later and people were like, dude, 4 Year Strong sounds like Nickelback now. What the hell?
Time is waiting, raise the light. They'll read about us when we die.
And I don't know if I'd say that that sounds like Nickelback exactly, but I get their point. I think maybe Foo Fighters would be a more fair comparison, but the point is that they kind of walked away from pop punk and were walking towards something that I guess you would call like mainstream radio rock.
I'm living out my broken dreams.
Only the problem is that they didn't do it nearly as well as Foo Fighters, and so, as you would probably expect, the fans were just kind of not really into it. And it seems like the band must have known that this was going to happen, because they actually have a song about it on the album called Fairweather Friends, which is sort of like, if you don't like us even though we play butt rock now, then you're not a real fan.
You're becoming what I hated. Close-minded and jaded about what isn't yours.
I don't love the album, but from their perspective, I do get it. They were still kind of trying to figure out who they were as a band and where they wanted to go. And if you get the chance to make a radio rock album with David Bendeth, one of like the top producers of all time, I would say you got to go for it. That's a chance you can't let slip through your hands. And so in that respect, I support that they did it because you don't know what's possible until you try it. And it seems like this album was just kind of a speed bump or a little detour on what has turned out to be an otherwise excellent discography. And I would say that their new stuff is some of the best stuff that they've ever done.
You feel my heartbeat from the passenger seat as you tell me all the things that you can do to me.
And thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've used Squarespace for almost a decade now for my personal website, and I genuinely think their product is fantastic. You can connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated members-only content, manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights all in one easy-to-use platform. And use their powerful blogging tools to categorize, share, and schedule your posts as well. And they also do e-commerce. Just go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thepunkrockmba to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And as always, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every podcast a week early. There are members-only areas of the Discord that I'm super active in. There's also a way to have me review your music or artwork or video or anything else that you want to get my eyes or ears on. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out at the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.